Thank you, Devon. I also actually wrote something called Affirmative Action Rhetoric, which I may say a word about because it came from 1991, which is about the same time. I really am honored to be here, too, on reconsidering whiteness as property and critical foundations in your company. I'm so happy to see all of you. It wasn't like this when I started teaching in 1976, and maybe I can let that go, although I probably can't. But you can imagine what it was like being the first woman on various faculties, which is true of me. All right. And I reread Cheryl's article, and I was struck by her courage. She was thorough, she was prescient, she was a truth teller, and she was courageous. I do think, at least now rereading it, that she foresaw that one possible outcome of the trends of the time that she surveyed could be the dystopic situation we're in today, the dystopia of the U.S. And at least rereading from today's vantage point, I think she foresaw the possibility, which was already sort of upon us, that affirmative action would be further gutted, and the possibility that white privilege would continue to reassert itself in many ways, that the Voting Rights Act could be gutted, that maldistribution of wealth could steadily worsen, and the overpopulation of prisons with people of color would continue and even escalate. Yet Cheryl suggested and hoped for ways to forestall these outcomes, but at the same time, she was clear-eyed and a truth teller. And I know that this causes pain as well as joy when you write something like this. So thank you, Cheryl. Now, my assignment was to talk about critical foundations, so I would like to take a few minutes to talk about, first, about property and personhood, and then I would like to talk about the rhetorical capture that undermined the hopes for affirmative action. Some of this has been said already. Okay, so some of you have some readings, and it includes the original article that I published in 1982 entitled Property and Personhood. I later attempted some afterthoughts in a book of essays published in 1993 entitled Reinterpreting Property. There's also an article entitled Rhetorical Capture, published only a couple years ago in 2012. That was written for the Arizona Law Review Symposium on Civility in Political Discourse a year after the shooting of Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. So talking about property and personhood, the personality theory of property is an aspect of traditional liberal thought about property. That theory elaborates the notion that ownership is bound up with self-constitution or personhood. It connects property ownership with central ideological commitments of liberal thought involving freedom of individuals to shape their own selves and their self-development. I borrowed from Hegel in writing this piece and later wished I had said more about Kant. The traditional indicia of propertization aligning with this ideology are exclusive possession with the right to exclude others, the right to use, and the right to sell or alienate. I use the term, by the way, propertization these days instead of property because I want to emphasize that it's human construction and not the gods or immutable principles that tell us what's property and what isn't. It is we who propertize. Cheryl pointed out, in fact, that earlier conception of property, that is, prior to the high industrialization era, considered property more broadly than mere things, and perhaps Locke meant something broader than things when he started with the premise that every man has a property in his own person. Instead, the court awarded them only minimal damages and their farm was ruined. And it was a common intuition among my students that there was something awfully wrong with that case. And it wasn't anywhere in the literature, I noticed in my early years of teaching, when one steps in where, as a fool steps in where angels fear to tread. The critical part, however, was I was even more troubled by the constant use of the rhetoric of freedom, the ideology of self-constitution, when the property in question was held only for exchange. The main point I hope to get across was that most of the legal assignments of power that we recognize as property have little to do with these ideological underpinnings about personhood. There's a big difference between a person's attachment to her home and a corporation's attachment to its assets. I called one personal property and the other fungible property. I hope to get across that the individualist rhetoric of freedom, self-constitution, etc. doesn't apply to most of the instances in which this rhetoric is deployed to justify property, even though it does apply to things that are close to the person. I wanted to drive a wedge, in other words, between the ideological justification of property and the vast amount of property to which it is inapposite. Now, I recognize there's a continuum here, and that we can, and also that we ourselves in different moments can value something such as a wedding ring as personal in one context and fungible in another, meaning the wearer has personal connection but might not hesitate to give the ring value for insurance purposes. So the stark dichotomy, personal versus fungible, goes only so far, but it's a critical starting point. And today, I came back in contract to the same critique. We have large corporations today that condemn millions of people's right to redress of grievances through the use of fine print deletion of their rights in voluminous boilerplate that nobody reads and they wouldn't understand if they did read it. And that's even to assume, as conservatives, law and economic folks like to do, probably counterfactually most of the time, that firms are just saving money by doing this to us and passing it on to us, thereby paying consumers for the loss of their rights. Now, okay, in the era of industrialization, at least, property is considered to attach to things. This is a form of objectification, or in the powerful analysis of Lukács from the early 20th century, reification. And I cited Lukács in a 1987 article, and Cheryl also cited him in 1993. He wanted us to understand that thingification, say supposing something produced by people's labor as a thing, this thing, rather than how it came to be through the chain of people who had to work and had to give their time and what they knew and so forth. This all led us to misunderstand the relationships and the human continuity involved in production to the detriment of workers. But given the modern prevalence of thinking about property as attaching to objects or things, one could question whether whiteness is literally property or only metaphorically property, and Cheryl did address this. She handled this question, and I should say that when I was writing about property and personhood, I had not escaped from thingification, and I was talking about mostly people being personally bound up with things like their home or their wedding ring, for example. Cheryl handled the question by showing how the government enacted and enforced whiteness as property, by showing that whiteness functioned as exclusion, and by arguing that alienability, that is saleability, is not necessary for propertization, and cited me for that. I confess I had argued this in the context of things, and I did not reach the question of non-things. If we pursue thingification, we see that property does attach to intangible objects, such as intellectual property, though there I maintain that decision makers do their best to make tangibility a criterion, and we arrive at confused regimes related to information tangibility. And I once, to continue your list of titles, I also wrote something called Information Tangibility. It got published in a Swedish book, so I don't expect that you've read it. But we do it right. But can the term property, Cheryl asked herself, attach to a social structure that does not pretend to thingification per se? And she accomplished a detailed analysis that shows how a social structure with some of the classic characteristics or analogous characteristic of property can function, in fact, the way property supposedly functioned. So today I think the question whether whiteness is really property or only metaphorically property is really a non-question, thanks to Cheryl's work. In other words, I could say if it moves like a property interest and it quacks like a property interest, then it is a property interest. At least we call it usefully a property interest. Okay, now a major problem for personhood theory is what to do about bad attachment to things. How we should think about the situation in which someone's personhood is truly bound up with something, but we think or should think that that thing is bad. Morally bad, unjustified, bad for persons themselves, bad for others. And Cheryl put her finger right on this problem when she spoke of whiteness as property, as bad property for personhood. It was true that white people were genuinely bound up with their whiteness, identified with their whiteness, and so forth. And it was also true that this was bad. And Cheryl thought of this as bad property for personhood. I have to tell you, I never figured out how to handle this problem for the personhood theory. Certainly in the initial 1982 essay, I made a stab at it that I later regretted. I said that even if someone is bound up with property, we nevertheless should not treat that as personal when there's an objective moral consensus that to be bound up with that category of thing is inconsistent with personhood or healthy self-constitution. There's a lot wrong with this, and wisely Cheryl stayed away from it. I was groping for something. Objectivity, on the one hand, though, sounds like essentialism, and consensus sounds like naive skepticism, and putting them together doesn't do away with 3 centuries of liberal thought, so that didn't work. After a while, I thought that the problem of bad property and personhood should be referred directly to human flourishing, and I attempted to do that in later work, beginning with Market and Alienability in '87 and continuing with that book, Contested Commodities, in '96. I was trying to show that commodification leads to an inferior conception of human flourishing. And as Cheryl recalled, of course, slaves were literally commodities. She shows that really clearly. They were usable objects in a chain of production. And the problems of objectification associated with commodification didn't go away when Jim Crow was officially taken off the books. All right? Now, attempting to speak directly in terms of human flourishing does move beyond traditional liberalism. And that's good, not traditional individualism anymore. Personhood is not about the individual in a vacuum. It's about the human being living in a society of other human beings. And the role of the polity is to structure social life and use of resources so that everyone can cross the threshold into basic well-being and thereby the ability for meaningful self-determination. So this theory, which I talked about in Contested Commodities, in which I referred to work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, is primarily about structuring of institutions. And it's hard to know where human flourishing gets vague, and I didn't get much further, but the good for human beings must at least require equal concern and respect for all human beings. And Cheryl's piece recalls how people of color were conceptualized as subhuman or an inferior sort of human, and she does this with explicitly and with great power, reminded us that dominant and subordinate positions within the racial hierarchy were disguised as the product of natural law and science, leading to scientific truths that non-white people had smaller craniums and couldn't reach the higher level of thought of white people, and so on. And people who were subjugated ended up having to take on some of the characteristics that were expected of them in order to survive. And Cheryl tells this poignantly by the story of her grandmother's passing. And I can think of jazz musicians. Jazz is the most important American music, no question about it. It is. It's very complex music. It's cerebral. It's organized at many levels. It's not just vacant expression. Yet apparently black musicians had to hide the fact that they practiced hours per day, and they had to memorize their music to have audience accept them, because audiences thought that black people just had rhythm. So there was a lot of injury done through expectations and through people trying to survive, which Cheryl made clear. So I'm glad that Cheryl took notice of the problem of bad property for personhood, but it's still a problem in theory and practice. I'm going to say a few words about rhetorical capture now in my 1 minute left. And I don't have to say too much because people have already talked a lot about baselines and about using baselines that are unjust to arrive at unjust results. Rhetorical capture means using rhetoric to foreclose debate and re-entrench old prejudices. I wanted to use the term, I wrote affirmative action rhetoric in '91. I used the term rhetoric to refer to the habit of talking about affirmative action as if it were assumed that job candidates who were not white males were inferior. So the rhetoric was thumb on the scale. And this rhetoric, what scales represent justice too, right? And this thumb on the scale thing, which we saw in Devon's picture even, this was used even by sincere liberals who thought they supported affirmative action. They thought, in fact, we ought to hire those persons even though they weren't as good as we white guys, and recommended that we white guys should put a thumb on the scale. And this caused those of us who are not white guys to be hurt and offended when our positions were chalked up to affirmative action. Because we knew that the speakers, even though good-hearted liberals, believed the rhetoric, and some still believe it, and some to whom it is still applied are still being insulted and hurt by it. So in her article, Cheryl hit the nail on the head here. She recognized that those who think affirmative action is discrimination in favor of people of color and against whites, whether they favored affirmative action or were hostile to it, they are begging the question of a baseline. The baseline refers to what rights or entitlements a person or entity can be assumed to hold justly at the outset. Whites did not hold their property and whiteness justly, but their arguments about reverse discrimination always tacitly assumed that these rights and public privileges were justly held. They were begging the baseline question. When the Civil Rights Acts were enacted in the 60s, they prohibited discrimination in the sale of property or in restaurants and hotels. Some property owners thought it was a taking of property rights to deny the ability to exclude, which is a signal indicia of property. And this is not a dead issue. There we have Congress people who are still saying on the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act that it was a taking and should never have been enacted. So in order to disagree with arguments like that, we have to understand that it's rhetoric. We have to understand that when the status quo is unjust, it's rhetorical capture by begging the baseline question in public discourse and legal discourse contributes to the result that affirmative action largely failed and contributes to a lot of other deleterious results today. Affirmative action failed for lots of reasons, including the redlining, which caused severe inequality in education, and which Brown versus Board, even with all deliberate speed, could not correct, and which was intermeshed with severe wealth maldistribution, which only got worse. And I can't do justice to this complexity, which Cheryl did, for which we remain in her debt. Whiteness, I'm concluding here, whiteness as property was fraught with premonition because Cheryl foresaw where our situation was heading. So too bad Cheryl wasn't and isn't on the Supreme Court.